Evet, günaydın. Tülin Hanım'a çok teşekkürler. Kendisi zaten en iyi şekilde anlattığı için ben çok uzatmayacağım. İsmim Gökhan Şen, ben de Bloomberg'de çalışıyorum. Açıkçası benim için de çok faydalı oluyor konferanslar. Çünkü biz biraz daha ekonomi, finans odaklı giderken yeni ekonomiyi gözden kaçırmamaya çalışıyoruz. Dolayısıyla biz de ilham almaya, öğrenmeye devam ediyoruz. Moderasyon yapıyoruz, konuşuyoruz, dinliyoruz. Hakikaten faydalı oluyor. Tekrar herkes hoş geldi. Şimdi İngilizce ve Türkçe paneller olacak. Çok kısaca belki onu hatırlatmamda fayda var. Çünkü yabancı misafirlerimiz var. Üstelik onların da sayısı hiç de az değil. Dolayısıyla hem İngilizce hem Türkçe oldukça karışık bir gün olacak ama salondaki herkesin rahatlıkla da anlayacağına eminim. Şimdi ilk oturumla başlayalım. Günün ilk paneli Digitalization, Emergence of Fintechs and Convergences. Başlık bu. Moderatör Dilnişin Bayel olacak. Dilnişin Hanım'ı sahneye davet edelim. May I have you on the stage please? Managing Director of Accenture Turkey and also will be accompanied by Timm, Schipporeit, his advisor, investor, financial technology partners. May I have you on the stage as well please? Morning, you're welcome. And Sheel, Mohnot, his partner, 500 startups. May I also invite you to the stage please? And Gaye or Marketing Manager PayU and also Orkun Saitoğlu, Chief Sales Officer iyzico. I wish you a very good conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. So I think, have the honor of being the first panel and kick off the day, and I hope it's going to be a fruitful day of discussion, different perspectives from fintechs, from banks, insurance companies, and capital markets. So in order to use the time effectively, I would like to start our panel with our speakers. When I actually look at what's going on, not only in Turkey but globally, fintechs as a market getting more and more attraction globally. I'm sure every one of you has been making all these searches about different areas. And I think a couple of things becoming more and more tangible. One thing is not only in North America. When I look at the numbers, North America is leading still, but Asia and also Europe are the runner-ups with similar volumes of fintech investments in the last couple of years. And they're almost doubling and tripling the volume of number of companies and also volume of investment they're attracting. Another area I think which is also interesting, I would like to also get our speakers' opinion about it, is it's not only payments, but it's various parts of financial services like lending, payments in the B2B, scoring areas, and also how some of them are focusing on cybersecurity related topics which are impacting banks at the moment heavily. And then another area which was also interesting, fintechs are assumed to be more the competition to the conventional players, while what we see is more and more investment is getting through to collaborative ones. So it's not actually just a competition to the conventional markets, but it's kind of an accelerator, I would name it like that, to the conventional players, because for them I think it's an eye-opener, it's an accelerator. Instead of them making all these investments, it's a tool to leverage. So it's not just one-to-one, it's probably one-to-many in the most effective way. So these were my takeaways when I look at the global markets. So I would like to also get our speakers' opinions, starting from Timm. So the first question I have is, what do you think about the digitalization of financial services, and how have the conventional players reacted to calls for change, mainly because of technology, because of customer expectation, and all globalization impact?
First of all, thanks for having me. Excited to be here and hope to learn a little bit about the Turkish ecosystem in particular, to which we're pretty new actually, but already spoke to a couple of people and it seems like there's a good level of momentum and excitement. So great to hear that. So, look, I mean, as you just mentioned in your introductory remarks, I think you see every sort of profit pool and vertical within financial services being disrupted and attacked and addressed by startups. So if you take a conventional financial institution, a bank, obviously anything from wealth management to stock trading to lending to mortgages, any of these profit pools are starting to get picked up by a number of startups. And some of these obviously have been attacked for quite a while. Take payments, for example, take wealth management, which is a bit newer, lending, which is a bit newer, and then you have more recently others, such as, for example, mortgage lending and others that have been potentially more recent. But at the end of the day, as a startup, obviously every startup looks at where's a lot of profit being made within each bank, and what kind of proposition can I improve the customer experience upon by 10x? I think that's always how I look at it, is there a way to really improve the status quo by a very significant amount? And I think the ones that we've seen probably more successful are the ones where you have less barriers to entries for startups. So, and again, to your second question, sort of how do banks and startups work together? What you see is there is definitely some convergence, right? Particularly in the lending space, which is harder to crack because you don't only need a great marketing engine and a great credit scoring engine, but you also need lots of capital. And that's obviously something that traditional banks are still extremely good at. They have a lot of capital. They usually have relatively cheap access to funding from central banks, from the capital markets, from consumer deposits. So that's one area where we've, I think, seen a lot of convergence, where disruptors in the lending space have increasingly worked with financial institutions to basically get a more permanent capital base for the funding, because the limits to growth are rarely on the consumer acquisition side, it's really on the funding side. Mm-hmm. So that's probably where we see some convergence. And I think, secondly, I think none of the banks are sitting still. They obviously go to all these conferences. Actually, most conferences I go to these days, you actually see more representatives of incumbents and your traditional players, insurance and banks, than you actually see startup entrepreneurs, which I think is quite fascinating. So definitely they're paying attention. I think there is a continuum of activities. It starts from sort of in-house incubators, accelerators, to corporate venture capital funds, to ultimately M&A and acquisitions. And I think we've seen already a pretty strong increase in all of these activities, particularly kind of corporate venture capital funds being started by a number of banks and insurances. I think the number of inbounds and calls and discussions we have with these parties have definitely increased manifold over the last 24 months. But ultimately, I think every ecosystem is also quite different, and would love to learn a bit more about the Turkish one, obviously, but I think we see the US ecosystem being quite different to the UK and German ecosystem, because banks have different strength and different positions in each country. And particularly the contrast obviously very stark with emerging markets, where you see, for example, the telco operators have a very strong role in that whole fintech disruption. So I think it's sort of ecosystem dependent a little bit, how the incumbents react, and also what their ability to react is. It depends a little bit kind of what their relationship to the consumer is. I think in some of the more Western established market, their relationship with the consumer is probably a bit more strained, and the banks are not as loved as much. Whereas, for example, in emerging markets, telco operators still have a very strong brand. And again, would love to hear more what your perspective is on Turkey in that respect.
Okay, maybe our Turkish speakers can also contribute, because it was also a change in our market after the regulation related with payments, how different players, not only startups, but also telcos enter into the market. Okay, thank you very much. I see that there are still country-specific differences, but it's inevitable that the conventional players need to react. Either they collaborate or compete, but I think the best way is to collaborate, but let's see different perspectives. So, Sheel, I have the next question for you related with, from more the fintech side, because as I know you have a lot of investments on startups and also on fintechs globally. So what do you think about the potential of fintechs? And what are the characteristics of the successful ones?
Sure.
And what are the variety of different areas you see on the focus, like payments, lending, mortgages,
Sure.
scoring, and do you have any pattern of increase? What's your expectations?
Sure.
Both the successful ones, are they going to increase, and what will be the main factor making them successful?
Sure. So to give more background on us, we are a seed stage investor. So we invest very early on and very actively. So we've invested in over 250 startups just in fintech globally in the past 7 years. Now to your question, what is the potential of fintech? I think we're still relatively in early stages. And then along those lines, you mentioned the categories. I think fintech 7 or 8 years ago was basically payments companies for the most part. And that's still true in many emerging markets where the first thing that you do is payments. Then maybe the next thing you do is lending. And sort of the evolution in the developed world has been starting out in payments, then moving into lending on the consumer side, then lending SMB side, and then you had a bit of Bitcoin blockchain phase, and then you had insurance, and now more recently there's been a lot of real estate excitement. But sort of that's been the evolution over the past 7 or 8 years in fintech. And fintech itself as a term is actually relatively new. So if you do a Google Trends search of fintech, in December 2013, it was 4% of what it is today. So it's really just exploded over time, and investment in this space has also exploded globally, where I think 5 years ago it was only 12% of what it is today. So fintech has had a lot of explosion. In terms of what we look for successful companies, that's the secret sauce. You can't just tell that to everyone. No, just kidding. So at the early stage that we invest, we primarily look in fintech for the same things we look at for other companies, which is you look for a strong team. Now, in fintech, that might mean something different than it does in e-commerce or social networks, that sort of thing. A strong team to us means somebody with experience and somebody that we think can overcome some of the regulatory burdens that you have in fintech. We look for some technology advantage because we're not investing in specialty finance companies per se. We're investing in technology companies. And you look for a large addressable market. So those are sort of the things that we look for. Challenges that end up happening is, a lot of you in the audience are banks or insurance companies. One challenge that we have with startups is, especially if they're selling into banks, the sales cycle is so long that oftentimes, the sort of 18-month window of funding that they have with us, they might spend 12 of those months just getting into the POC with the bank, and then all of a sudden they don't have any money left. So for those banks out there, I would encourage you to move rapidly when working with startups.
Do you see any differences based on countries? Because
Yeah.
when you look at the global...
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the US market has been more developed in some ways and less developed in some ways than the European market. And that's partially due to a vestige of the past, partially due to regulatory reasons. But in other parts of Europe, I'm not as familiar with the Turkey market, but in other parts of Europe, you have this notion of challenger banks, which we don't have at all in the US. There's not been a new bank license issued for quite some time in the US. So in the US, all the fintechs are encroaching around different parts of the value chain in the bank. And they're doing payments, they're doing mortgage, they're doing insurance. Really, they're doing everything but being a deposit-taking institution. And if you think about a bank as simply a deposit-taking institution or the pipes, it's like the telcos becoming a data pipe, where they're just providing a base service, and then everything else is built on top of that, where you have WhatsApp and all these other things are just using the data itself. And I think a similar thing could happen for banks. And by the way, it's not the end of the world. Telcos are more profitable than they ever have in the past. But there is this notion that the person that, or the company that controls the customer is where the value accrues. So I understand why banks are trying to figure something out.
And I think we see already startups who dedicate themselves to be the pipe. So they try to just be the back end and the enablement layer for all the front end facing challenger banks,
Exactly.
new payments companies, etc. So I think there is definitely a role for either some banks to just fill that spot and just say, I want to be the enablement layer, the back end, or it can actually be other startups who decide to be that and not have any sort of customer facing front end.
Yeah. In Turkey, we have most of the banks having their mobile banking as one of their channel, while in other countries we also see mobile-only banks coming out, and then banks try to collaborate or buy and partner with those, like examples. So it's not just one area.
Yeah, I think in the UK it's pretty rampant. I mean, I think we have like 8 or 9 challenger banks. You do obviously ask yourself, is that sustainable? Is there enough market? Are there enough customers who seek to switch actually their bank accounts? So something we always look at is how many of those customers that one of these challenger banks has are actually salaried accounts or direct debit accounts, because those tell you that basically these customers are really using that bank account as their core bank account, but what you actually most of the time see that most of the accounts are not salary or direct debit accounts, so they're kind of secondary accounts because the challenger bank has a particularly nice user interface. It has a kind of sort of particular proposition when it comes to FX payments or peer-to-peer payments. So I think that's something that's still to play out. I think to get customers away from banks is actually pretty hard in the core kind of deposit taking regular my main bank account. It's not that easy. You need to focus on certain demographics or a certain user group or particular functionalities to really get people away from banks, right, and be their primary bank account.
Yeah, I completely agree. In the UK, we'll see how this plays out over the next several years. In the US, we had one real sort of mobile-first challenger called Simple. It was one of our companies, actually. They built a waiting list of 500,000 people. So 500,000 people said they want this. And then when they launched, finally, first of all, it took a while because of regulatory reasons and finding a bank partner in the US. But when they launched, it turns out that, very few people might try it out and have a few $100s in their account. No one was actually using it as a primary account, or very few people were. And this is a big problem. So ultimately, the way I think about it is I've had the same bank account for nearly 20 years now. The same bank account I got when I was a kid, basically. And there's no real reason for me to change. I think about it like, I changed my email address in 2004. I changed to Gmail. And I changed to Gmail because before that I had Hotmail. And Hotmail was only giving you 20 megabytes of space. And Gmail came out and said, we're giving you 1 gigabyte. And I was constantly deleting my emails from Hotmail. Every day I would get too many emails. And Gmail, I didn't have to delete my emails. It was 50 times better, 50 times more space. And I don't think there's any experience that's 50 times better or something that's 50 times better that's going to cause me to change my main bank account. So that's a challenge, and that's the advantage that the incumbents have.
Probably it's the challenge of understanding real value proposition to the customer and making it clear.
That's right.
Because it wasn't just the mail account, but it was the
But the difference,
space.
though, is you do have this sort of new generation of people growing up digital first, mobile first. And in many parts of the world, you have massive distrust of banks. So it is possible that now is the time. And, this group of people that grew up digital first, you can attract them. And the notion of trust is very different than it was, in my generation or the generations before, where trust used to be the bank having the nicest building in town, and you could trust them because of that. And now trust is a better user experience.
Okay. Thank you very much. And Gaye Hanım, as you're also coming from banking background, so you know the bank side and also now you're working for a fintech company. So considering your experience, how would you evaluate the local market? Considering all the different perspectives from the international ones. And also do you think the fintechs and banks are coming together in a collaborative way, or is it still a market of competition? And maybe the challenges and maybe accelerators like PSD2, because now on the financial services we're talking about PSD2 and it will have an impact. In Europe, banks are getting ready for it. So what's your perspective about our market?
Thanks. Actually, it's a little bit difficult question, especially for Turkish market, because when it comes to fintech, actually there are everywhere banks and other companies, as you can see. But in Turkey, banks are very strong, and when it comes to technology, they are very advanced. And this is actually is a good thing for us as a consumer. But on the other hand, there are several people, several millions of people that bank cannot reach. And this is a lack of financial services in banking industry. And I worked for Garanti Bank, for example. They have enormous strategy, technology, and they are very disruptive. They were actually very disruptive. But however, when it comes to fintech, people cannot easily understand the value of fintech industry. This is one of the biggest problems in Turkey we face of. For example, banks can do everything in Turkey. And that's why we always talk about competition. And some banks are more interested in fintech industry, but they are always talking about supporting startups and other companies. But no one talks about making partnerships or collaborations, because actually when we are together, we can change Turkish ecosystem. And this is the necessary thing we have to do. I believe that because of my experience in financial industries. And about startups, we have to talk also about the importance of regulations, which are very important in Turkey. As I said before, banks are very strong. They have their own association, BKM, Interbank Car Center. And also, on the other hand, regulators are very strong and they can easily change everything. For example, a few months ago, BDDK decided to close credit cards to online transactions. And it's a massive step, even for banks or fintech companies, etc. And we have to work together to change these regulations, because at the end of the day, we all work for consumers. Even people or even for merchants, it doesn't matter. We have to think about our consumer, and we have to develop necessary products to create a value for them. And this is the thing we do not forget, I guess. That's why we shouldn't talk about competition. We should talk about how to build valuable partnerships for consumer itself. Yeah.
And PSD2, do you think
Yeah,
it's going to
PSD2.
impact?
Yeah, PSD2 actually a very interesting topic, because if you know the Turkish ecosystem, you can easily see that we are trying to adapt ourselves to European Union regulations. And right now we are applying PSD1 regulations in Turkey. And also we know that people work on PSD2 regulations as well as Europe. And I guess after 3 or 4 years, European Union will start to apply all the regulations. And probably Turkey will follow that. And PSD2 will create a great impact on fintech industry because, as you know, we are surrounded by regulations. I can easily tell this from a point of view, a fintech company. But after PSD, for example, open API is a great thing, especially for us. And it will change everything, and also it will open the way of smaller startups. For example, there isn't any startup like Mint in Turkey. It's we need this as a consumer. But however, because of the limits, no one is able to do this. But after PSD2, people, even a simple software guy, can develop a brand new product based on this API, which will change Turkish market.
And puts more pressure on the banks, right? Because again, it increases the risk of becoming that dumb
Yeah,
pipe
I didn't want to say this, but yes.
No, but I think it does. But on the other hand, it kind of it means that the banks are forced to very actively think about what is my value proposition, right? Is my value proposition just to keep you as a customer and protect my data and build a big wall and castle wall around my proposition, or do I want to be open, and do I want to embrace, and do I want to innovate myself to then actually keep that customer and have a valuable customer proposition?
Yeah, it's kind of continuous call for improving customer
Absolutely.
experience rather than having the luxury
Yeah.
of licensed services in your portfolio. Yes, I agree, and it's good for customers. And I think in a collaborative way, it will be good for both parties. And for the last part, so my question is to Orkun Bey. When you consider the fintechs versus legacy, so we have been talking about banks as the giants, very strong, and should it be a play for partnership as we talk about competition, and how do you think these should come together? So what should be the way these companies come together? Because when I also think about the big organizations like banks versus fintechs, which are small, agile, I think it's even difficult to find the right contact in a bank if you have an idea, if you have a startup. Probably you're big enough to have a strong brand in the market as a fintech, but in terms of you have an idea maybe on scoring or lending or real estate and the mortgages. You want to knock the door of a bank, and who to touch, how you explain your value proposition, and when you come together with a team from the bank, how you really secure your idea, because they can also do it. So how you manage this process. So what do you think is going to be the accelerators in this process? Maybe regulation. And what are the right ways you are experiencing when making this happen?
Good question. How we manage the relation with the banks? First of all, as Gaye said, that in Turkey, banks are really strong, especially technologically. When we look at the fintech sector, fintech vertical, I think that the most achieved part is the payments. It has all started with PayPal, and on the scene now we are two ex-PayPal people, for example. That's the proof. PayPal was founded in 1999, and then there were some other strong players like Adyen, Klarna in Europe, then Stripe, Braintree, WorldPay. And in Turkey, we follow the same trend. So the fintech, I can say that, by being humble, but fintech started with payment companies again. International players coming in, PayPal entered to the market in 2010, PayU entered to the market in 2011, but also local players like us, iyzico, founded in 2012. And now iyzico is the second most funded technology company in Turkey, which shows that we follow this global trend of fintech. The first one is Yemek Sepeti, already acquired, but the second one is iyzico. So I think that on payment companies, the one thing which is helping us is the regulation. We have a regulation now. We have a license from BRSA, so we are regulated to make this company. Of course, in the beginning, banks, they were a little bit conservative towards fintech, to payment companies too, to see to understand what's our business model, what's our purpose. But now it's been more than 3 years that we are working all together, and I think that I can say that we found the ways to show them, to prove them there is a win-win collaboration opportunity. Of course, I cannot say not all the banks are on the same level, but however, we shouldn't forget that digital generation started to work at banks too, which makes some collaboration opportunities easier. And on the other hand, I'm sure that you know better than me, but in all the banks, the agenda is right now digitalization.
Yes.
In Turkey too. They are all working in digitalizing the banking system. So for example, in our specific case, we show them that, you know, a full manual process on their side, they can make it fully digital by collaborating us. Why I'm saying this one? Because we are onboarding our merchants fully in digital way. So the merchant doesn't need to go to anywhere. So to propose exactly the same experience to a merchant for a bank, it may take maybe a couple of years.
Yeah.
But by working with us now, you know, we have more than 10,000 active merchants. So banks can reach to a wider audience. So I think that again, payment companies, we are just opening this route. Hopefully when there will be regulations in place for lending, credit, scoring, etc., banks will be keen to work with the new players too. And I would also highlight that now we can see lots of, I'm sure that there are lots of friends and colleagues from banks in the room, in this room too, but also there are lots of banks who are starting some accelerators, who are helping startups, you know, to grow. And hopefully they are now more convinced to make partnership for this startup with a win-win model. But my advice to startups, they should show to the banks on different levels, on, you know, executive levels, on management levels, on all levels, what is the win-win opportunity, and to tell this story maybe 3, 4, 5, or 6 times to convince them. But in Turkey, I think that banks technologically, they are really good, and it's a great opportunity for fintech companies to use banks as a platform.
Yeah.
For example, last weekend, there was one bank who organized a hackathon, and they opened 33 APIs to the entrepreneurs.
Kuwait Turk, I guess.
Kuwait Turk, yes. And I'm sure that the others will follow this one too, because they want to digitalize the banking system. Let's imagine a world in a couple of years that all Turkish banks, very technologically strong, tech-savvy people, they are opening all their APIs. And we are just the starters, but there will be other followers who will use this API to propose a great consumer and merchant experiences.
It's also crowdsourcing new ideas, probably.
Exactly.
And also one more thing, banks have hundreds of products, and that's why. But when it comes, for example, payment, this is our core business. That's why we have to transform ourselves. We have to be better day by day. But banks doesn't have the enough operation or enough time or enough source to be the specialist of this core industries. You know what I mean? That's why it will be great if we can collaborate in various ways. As I said before, at the end of the day, consumer should the winner, not us.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you very much for your valuable feedbacks. Before closing, maybe I can ask if our audience wants to ask and get your perspective about any specific topics.
Just while we wait, maybe following up on that, I think what is important for startups, at least what I see, is you need to get to a certain stage and to a certain level of maturity before really engaging with banks. I think if you just out of the gate start to look for all these partnerships and kind of integrations with banks, I think it can really hurt your speed and your ability to get to a certain scale. So I think the ones that we've seen as really the ones that are really, really successful and have become fairly large, they've gone a fair way on their own, and then at some point they realized, okay, it may be helpful to partner with this bank or with this insurance or this incumbent while still innovating on their own. So it depends a little bit on the stage, I think, when it's sensible to engage with incumbents given the speed and effort it requires to find the right partner.
Yeah.
On
I mean,
this
in
one-
some countries, some countries, I also see that, like we are also as Accenture facilitating some of those platforms in different countries. So banks are forming some kind of consortiums. They're sharing their needs collectively with all the fintechs, and eligible fintechs are invited to the process. And in the process, they are both improving their ideas. They're trying to use these APIs, put them on cloud. They show the right business case based on what the banks are looking for. And at the end of the day, both the banking side and also fintechs are winning because it's kind of a understanding with the structured approach instead of one-to-one trials. I have a nice idea and I see the opportunity. So probably at country level, we need also some more structured platforms to accelerate fintechs and these businesses. Sorry, you were saying
Yeah, I think that on this one, it's one thing that the golden rule, of course, a real problem should be solved.
Yes.
For example,
starting
I can
point
give you
is
an
the-
example on P2P. In Turkey, in my experience, using banking system, there is no P2P problem because all these mobile banking apps are so good designed that you can send the money instantly. While comparing, for example, in France, I lived in France for 7 years, you must still go to the branch to make a wire transfer to a friend. So there's a real problem of P2P in France, but
Yeah.
not in Turkey,
Yeah.
again. So because of that, especially entrepreneurs, while building fintech companies, they shouldn't only think only their agenda, but they need to think their bank's agenda too, and they need to prove to the banks that they will improve their proposal
Yeah,
too.
it's at the end of maybe a triangle win-win. Customer who has the pain point, fintech and the bank
Exactly.
Yeah.
coming together.
And I think
Okay.
it's like a lot of companies start with a very narrow proposition, which is usually how you kind of really get virality, how you win, and how you also create a very good user experience. But then there is obviously convergence, and we see that a lot now between lenders, between neobanks, between kind of robo-advisors. There's a lot of convergence because
Yeah.
a lot of them realize for me to actually generate enough sort of customer lifetime value with that customer that I paid dearly for, I need to offer him probably more services than just a savings account or a kind of wealth management solution. But I actually need to cross-sell them. So you come a little bit full circle to
Yes.
where the
Or-
banks are. They have a customer and they cross-sell him all sorts of kind of products throughout his life cycle. And I think we see more and more startups that manage to gain real scale in one very specific opportunity, say stock trading or wealth management or mortgage lending. They then decide, okay, I need to do more. And either you do that via partnering with other fintechs, or you partner with banks, or you start to develop more products on your own. So there are various avenues, but I think that's also part of the convergence that we see.
I agree. So if you don't have any questions, I would like to there's a question, sorry.
Think
Is
you
there
just
a
go
mic?
ahead.
Yeah.
Shout it out.
Can Sungurtekin, Citibank.
Can you please speak to the mic?
Hi. At what level do you think an entrepreneur should be going to a bank for a collaboration, for a partnership? I mean, as for example, iyzico. Do you think iyzico would be so successful if, I mean, we know that many banks are just organizing incubation days where they are gathering the entrepreneurs to just develop ideas for their sectors. And do you think iyzico would be so successful if you would have gone to a bank at a very early stage, or do you think is it better to go for a collaboration after maybe some specific milestones?
In our case, in our specific case, we must go to the banks just at the beginning because acquiring in Turkey only banks can make acquiring, and we need acquiring services. So we started our discussion just on the day one with the banks. But I can say that it wasn't like the answer wasn't yes on the first day. So it took some time to convince the banks that there is a good potential of partnership. And even I think that the latest bank, it took us 2.5 years to convince them to work together. And there are still some banks who doesn't work with us. So to answer this question. On the other hand, I think that for these questions, the response to these questions will be different for any different sectors. In some cases, I know some of the startups in Turkey who are selling their products to the banks in very early stages because banks are using their product internally and externally too. So I think that right now, lots of banks has put some point of contacts in different accelerators, incubators, etc. So I'm always saying that it will be good to start discussing just maybe on the day one. And if a bank can take your idea and can execute faster than you, then it's good that they are doing it,
Okay. Okay, thank you very much for your contribution. The next panel will be with the banking leaders. So we will also, I think, hear their perspective after we start with the fintechs and the investment companies. I hope it was a helpful session. Thank you for listening and joining it. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.